If you're watching this on Moodle or floated by on YouTube, a very warm welcome. My name is Rory Lees-Oakes, and in this presentation we're looking at barriers to effective communication. The aim of the presentation is to form a supplemental study guide for students undertaking the Certificate in Counselling Concepts Level 2 or equivalent qualification. So let's look at the types of barriers that may be around for people. Well, there's emotional barriers, there's physical barriers, there's language barriers, and also there's cultural barriers. There are quite a few others, but I've just picked on these just to give you an example of the types of barriers that may be around and how they can be overcome. So emotional barriers, this is sometimes around fear, guilt or shame, and the strong feeling that you may be judged as less by another person. Certainly some people who have had a background of perhaps not being valued and not being shown love may very well have a lot of fear and guilt and shame. And as you can see, I've put some pictorial representations up of guilt, fear and shame. But what can we do about that? So how do we overcome emotional barriers? Well, provide a safe environment for people to visit and discuss their issues. So if you are providing an environment where people want to come and talk about their lives, then it has to be safe. Rooms have to be confidential, and the whole of the building or the rooms that you're using needs to show that it's a safe place for people to come. I would say provide an emotionally warm and non-judgmental environment for service users. For people who come who've had emotional barriers, they may have been under judgments from other people, quite harsh judgments in some cases. So it's important that anybody working with a service user realises this and uses a non-judgmental approach. And make sure that staff have relevant training in listening skills. You don't have to be a counsellor to offer non-judgmental warmth and good listening. And it makes such a difference to people who have come from a very difficult emotional place just to feel heard. I heard a wonderful quote the other day. It wasn't mine, unfortunately. It came from a TV programme I was watching. And it said at the end of the day, the only two things that people need in their life when things are really bad is to know they're loved and know they're not alone. And I thought that was a really powerful statement, and there's so much truth in that. So the idea that someone cares and they're not alone, and that really does overcome or help to overcome emotional barriers. The next one's physical barriers, and they can be described as any obstacle, either material or technical, which prevents a service user accessing the venue or engaging with the service it provides. That's my own quote, and I'll give you some examples of that. Noise is an incredible physical barrier. If you're trying to listen to someone and it's a noisy environment, a very busy environment, that almost certainly will stop people engaging in the service. And also it is a barrier to communication, because you cannot communicate if you cannot be heard. And also accessibility, and I've put the symbols down here. They're the universal symbols, I guess, for showing people with disabilities or hearing impairment or sight impairment that the organisation is set up to support them by making adaptations to, could be websites, it could be rooms, it could be the actual fabric of the building. And that's important too, because anything that stops people accessing the service is ultimately a barrier to communication. So if you want to overcome physical barriers, make sure all service users can access the building and the services you provide. And that includes things like websites, it includes things like telephones, it includes any aspect of the service. Just make sure that everybody can access it in their own way. Invite feedback from all service users in the development of any service you offer. My experience would tell me that the best services are the ones that are developed by the service users for service users. So it's about listening to what your audience, I guess, the service users have to say, and working to their needs. And also make sure that staff have relevant training to raise awareness of physical barriers. So it can be that sometimes staff don't have the relevant training or aren't aware of it. I can remember many years ago doing an audit on a hostel that I worked on, and it was passed for disabled users in wheelchairs, or users who use wheelchair users is the correct term, until it was pointed out that actually, although a lot of the services could be accessed, the actual room where the washing was done, the laundry, was down a set of stairs which couldn't be accessed by a wheelchair. So consequently, they couldn't advertise the hostel as suitable for people with a walking disability, where they'd need to be wheelchair users. So it's kind of very easy to miss the small details out. And again, it's a barrier to communication. If people can't get to you, they can't communicate with you. Language barriers. Well, that's use of expressions, jargon, or words that others are not familiar with. So we all can fall in, I guess, to using jargon. The difficulty with that is that it does kind of put a barrier up between service users and staff, or anybody accessing the service. And if people are shy, or they're not quite confident in asking what things mean, it's possible that people just won't engage. Many years ago, I went to a meeting, which was a LIT meeting, local implementation team meeting, for a number of agencies that worked in the world of mental health. And they had so many acronyms. An acronym is a word made of the beginning of other words. So BBC would be an acronym, British Broadcasting Company, BBC, that's an acronym. They had so many acronyms that they had to have an acronym sheet, and I didn't have one. So I sat there for an hour, and I did not understand a single word they were saying. I might as well have been living on another planet, which was quite bizarre. And I never went back to that series of meetings because there was no point. I couldn't understand what they were saying, and I couldn't get a sheet to decode what was being said. So language, acronyms, or words that are confusing. Communication breakdown due to no language in common. Well, we do meet people whose language isn't our own, and sometimes we have to be creative when trying to get information across, and we'll come to that later on in the presentation. And a misunderstanding of what's being said. That's one of the biggest barriers to communication, where one person believes they're being clear and accurate, yet the other person, in fact, hasn't understood what's being said. So I'll give you some examples. We've got jargon, slang, which is vulgar, socially taboo, and very informal. Lingo, language or speech, especially if strange or foreign. And jargon, unintelligible or meaningless. And generally speaking, it's language that can only be understood by a particular group. So if you're getting into the lingo or the slang or the jargon of the work you do, it could be that what you're doing is you're sidelining or pushing away or discounting people who don't have that particular language to speak. So overcoming language barriers, well, when a person does not understand the language that you are using, you can use charts, drawings, gestures, or facial expressions. It's not ideal, but it at least shows you're making an effort. And also, people appreciate that. People appreciate that you'd make an effort. Shouting loudly in English, or whatever your chosen language is, in the hope that the volume of the language would aid understanding, I'm afraid doesn't work. We all know that. So sometimes you have to use more creative ways of getting your message across. Try to use words that most people can understand. So think of how you speak. Think of your vocabulary. In other words, vocabulary is the number of words you have in your mind, I guess. And make sure that you don't use words that people don't understand. And if you are speaking with someone of a different language, then you can use a translator. They can be either over the phone, you can phone translation services up, or you can buy in translators. So that is usually a good idea if someone speaks a completely different language and you can't find any common ground, if you like, in terms of language. And try rephrasing what you have discussed to see that the message has been understood. I always just ask people a very simple question: what do you think I meant by that? And once they repeat their meaning, their understanding, then there's usually a great chance, a better chance, that they will have understood the meanings of what I've said. So let's have a look at cultural barriers. Well, they could be religious beliefs, they could be body language, social habits. So there's three there that kind of tie up. Some of them kind of go together. Cultural barriers are some category of words, phrases, symbols, actions. Colours mean different things to different people of different countries, cultural backgrounds. So we have to be thoughtful of that. And I'll give you an example of that. Have a look at these two symbols. The one on the left is a swastika, and indeed the one on the right is a swastika. But just think about this. One's a Nazi flag with all the kind of evil and nastiness that kind of is attached to that, but the other is a Hindu religious symbol, still used in the Hindu culture today. And in fact, the word swastika is a Hindu word. It was taken by the Nazis. They kind of stole it with a lot of other things. But if you see a swastika, like the one on the right, it is actually a religious symbol. So it's easy just to get confused maybe. You see a symbol and you think it's one thing, but actually it might mean something else. So overcoming cultural barriers. Well, you can overcome cultural barriers by respecting other people's beliefs and social habits. Seek clarification. If you do not understand, a thoughtful inquiry usually gets a thoughtful response. And that's been my experience. I've met people from many different cultures, and if I didn't understand something about their culture, I just politely asked. And I've always got a thoughtful and respectful response, and I've learned something. If you approach it in the right way, majority of people, human beings, will take that thoughtfulness and that respect and tell you what you need to know. To overcome cultural barriers, you need to start by looking at what your service users require. Once you understand their needs, then you can develop mutual respect and trust. And it really goes back to asking your service users what they want from your service, and keep them as an integral part of their organisation. Make it their own, because it's their service for those people. So it makes sense to involve them wherever possible with any decision that involves their service. If you want further information, well, if you watched on Moodle, if you click the resource tab here, I'll put some handouts in a zip file that you can download and have a look at. Or if you're watching on YouTube, if you go into the bar below, I'll put some links in to take you to other websites so you can do some browsing and just have a look at other barriers to communication. And finally, thank you for watching.